Suspicious interpreters decide that Joseph is unreliable, perhaps even scheming. Critical interpretations of Joseph's vision share a common hermeneutic or explanatory method. They begin with an assumption about how a person in Joseph's position would have acted if his story were true, and then they show that Joseph's accounts vary from that assumed scenario. Sometimes they even postulate an alternative to Joseph Smith's explanation. Two writers, Fawn Brodie and Wesley Walters, have largely shaped the skeptical interpretations of Joseph Smith's first vision. They first articulated the arguments that others have since adopted and published and that circulate widely today.
Fawn Brodie speaks of Joseph Smith's first vision as a half-remembered dream. It's an evocative phrase and shows sort of her poetic nature. But if you read Joseph Smith's accounts of his visions, they are remarkably concrete and detailed. And if you have a dream, and you wake up in the morning wanting to remember it, by 9 o'clock in the morning you've forgotten most of it, and you have just little phases of it still in your head. So call it a dream if you wish, but it is not half remembered. It's fully remembered. It's details, concrete details.
The accounts themselves show half remembered is a uninformed comment. It sounds like a cliche today, and it's just a way of putting Joseph Smith down by saying he didn't tell me enough about it to convince me.
Her other argument was that any event as massively significant as the visit of God in Christ should have been reported in the newspapers. If Joseph Smith started telling people, "I've seen God in Christ," a reporter would be on his doorstep the next day. And so she thought this was evidence that nothing had happened in 1820 and it was all fabrication later on. Since that time, of course, we found these earlier accounts that I mentioned a moment ago in 1832. So we have reason to believe that it's part of Joseph Smith's mentality from an early time on. And when he wrote the 1832 account, he didn't show it to anyone that we know of. He just wrote it. So he's not trying to prove himself to anyone. He's just trying to get down what happened to him. So the evidence itself undercut what Fawn Brodie had originally written. However, what I did that went beyond her was to show that the first vision account was not a unique experience in Joseph Smith's culture, that this was a visionary culture, that other people were having visits of angels and views of heaven, being taken to heaven, seeing God in Christ, so that you don't have to think that it was so extraordinary that it would, without question, be recorded in the newspaper. So that sort of undercut her explanation of its non-reporting.
Fawn Brodie did not change her assumption when she revised her biography of Joseph Smith after the 1832 and 1835 accounts of his vision were discovered and published. She did not alter her conclusion in light of the evidence that Joseph had spoken openly about the vision on more than one occasion before 1838.
Brodie stuck to that in her second edition. A lot of accounts of Joseph Smith had come out, and she said this was probably manufactured in order to prop up his image as a prophet in 1838. He was a successful man and had to develop a mythological past, essentially.
Wesley Walters was a Presbyterian minister. Beginning in the 1960s, he published several articles that claimed that there was no religious revival in Palmyra, New York around 1820, and therefore Joseph Smith's claims to have been influenced by such religious fervor must be false. Historians of the first vision credit Walters for awakening them to the importance of the historical context of Joseph's first vision, but they fault him for forcing his thesis.
A number of people were concerned because Wesley Walters, Presbyterian minister, had published a pamphlet saying that Joseph did not write an accurate or reliable account of the background of the first vision, that there's no evidence of a great revival in Palmyra in 1819 and 20, that the great revival took place a few years later. And we didn't really have an answer to that question because no one had done serious research on really the historical setting of Mormonism, on events that took place in the Palmyra area at the time of the first vision.
Joseph's accounts do not claim that the revivalism was centered in Palmyra town itself, as Walters argued. Rather, Joseph located the unusual excitement on the subject of religion around Manchester, New York, and he used a Methodist term to describe a wider geographical area than Walters' emphasis on Palmyra village. Joseph said the whole district of country seemed affected by it. To a 19th century Methodist, a district was somewhat akin to an LDS stake or a Catholic diocese.
There's no question that Wesley Walters performed a very positive service to the cause of Mormon history, because he was a delver. He went deep into the very heart of the archives. And Mormons had accepted a lot of things as simple fact. For example, that there was a revival in Joseph Smith's neighborhood around the 1820 period. He drew that into question. And so what can you do but search under every stone to try to find evidence that there was a revival? He made us realize we can't assume anything. Everything had to be demonstrated and proved. And since his time, I think we have examples of Mormon historians getting deeper and deeper into the sources. The Joseph Smith papers, for example, they don't take anything for granted. And you could say that started with Wesley Walters.
As I continued to search the area of revivalism in upstate New York, I continued to turn to Joseph Smith's account, where he said that in the second year after removal to Manchester, there was in the place where we lived unusual religious excitement. It began with the Methodists, but soon became general among all the sects in that region of country. In fact, in the whole region of country, great multitudes united themselves to the different religious communities. And I noticed that Wesley Walters, Reverend Walters, had misrepresented Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith never wrote that there was a great revival in Palmyra. He was living in Manchester, and he said that the revival was in the whole region of country. I found the local newspapers that described hundreds of people joining churches in upstate New York.
What he did on a positive way was go into the Palmyra religious scene and open up what Mormon historians had not really talked about before that. And Reverend Walters' problem is that he dealt with negative evidence, which is a contradiction in terms. He adopted the thesis, one, there was a big revival after 1820, two, there were no revivals before 1820, and that's where he's totally wrong.
Reverend Walters' thesis has indeed been discredited, but the discovery of considerable evidence for revivalism in and around Palmyra, and especially in the region that Joseph's accounts describe, did not alter the argument that Walters continued to make throughout his life.
At those revivals, the respective preachers would preach from the stand and give their messages, and the hearers would quail at their feet or come forward to be saved. And they might last several days. And individuals would get religion. And there would be those who would be encouraging their loved ones to go forward and be saved on those occasions. We don't always hear about it in the local newspapers unless something unusual happens, or if the Methodist magazine happened to pick up on the revival, as with Marmaduke Pierce and George Lane. Reverend George Lane must have been very effective in the 1820 revival. In 1820, he left the Susquehanna district, On his way to the annual Genesee conference, Reverend Peck stopped and conducted a camp meeting, perhaps more than one, as he was going up. Benijah Williams, a Right Reverend gentleman who was in the Bloomfield circuit. He ran into George Lane under interesting circumstances. They were conducting a camp meeting. Even before he went up, right at the time, on the 15th and the 16th of June. And in his journals, Benijah said, "The Lord prepared himself a preacher." Brother Lane, a presiding elder from Susquehanna District, Brother Lane exhorted and spoke on God's method in bringing about Reformation.
The Walters thesis, though heartfelt and tenaciously defended by himself, and uncritically accepted and perpetuated by others, no longer seems tenable or defensible. I don't find it hard to empathize with Wesley Walters or Fawn Brodie. She was raised as a Latter-day Saint, but chose to leave the faith. For her and like-minded souls, that painful reorientation process requires a reinterpretation of Joseph Smith's first vision.
Fawn Brodie was raised on the first vision like every Mormon child growing up. She knew everything about it. She knew it was fundamental. So she knew she had to find some explanation for it. And using what was available to her at that time, she came to the conclusion that the first vision account written in 1838 was an attempt by Joseph Smith to reaffirm his own authority. He'd gone through all the post-Kirtland Bank troubles in 1837. He was facing opposition virtually everywhere. And her view was that when he left Kirtland and went to Missouri, he sat down and said, "I need to write something that will demonstrate I am truly a prophet." And so he concocted the first vision story right then and there. Of course, later on we discover all these other first vision accounts, and in fact it's Fawn Brodie's version of things that drove us to search for those early accounts. So we now have the 1832 account, and on the basis of that we find hints of the first vision even in section 20, recorded in 1830.
For those who choose to read Joseph's accounts with the hermeneutic of suspicion, the interpretation of choice is likely to remain that he elaborated some half-remembered dream, or that he concocted the vision from sheer invention. Those are not historical facts. They are skeptical interpretations of the fact that Joseph reported over and over that he had seen a vision